Hey guys, Grandmaster Mon Hamilton here, bringing you a tips and tricks series on the London system from both white and black's perspective. I thought we would start out today with one of the most important tricks in the London system. It happens from the white side, but I'm going to show you guys a few things that you might not know about this. First of all, I say it's the most well-known trick, but that doesn't mean you already know it. It's involving bishop takes h7, if that gives you any clue as to what it might be. Bishop f4, knight f6, and if we go forward here, we'll actually see that after knight c6, knight d2, e6, c3, we've reached the main position in the London system. I would call this essentially the main line. So after bishop g3, white plays to recapture with the h-pawn. Black usually castles, and after bishop to d3 by white, then black is faced with a choice here. And he has a number of ways to continue. b6, rook e8, queen c7, queen e7, a lot of different moves to choose from. I wanted to focus on one of them right now, which is queen e7, and that invites the variation that I'm talking about. After queen e7, there's the cardinal rule that basically if black gets the move e5 in, he's already a little bit better. So queen e7, let's say castles, e5, everybody exchanges, and doesn't really matter what white plays here, but regardless, black is going to stand slightly better with pretty easy play and control of the center. So for that reason, in this position, white usually plays knight e5, not to allow black to advance. After knight e5, black has the move knight d7, which is often a consideration. And here there's a really well-known trap for white, which goes knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and after pawn takes c5, queen c5, there's the rather beautiful bishop takes h7 check. And it looks like, how could you possibly play this move with no, backup involved at all? The queen might give a check, but that's about it. Well, actually, after king g8, knight e4 hits the queen and utilizes the lateral pin from the queen on h5. You might think, well, maybe g6 is a nice intermezzo. Unfortunately, it doesn't really help you as white picks up not only the queen and the piece back, but because he's hitting the rook as well, knight f6 and knight takes h5 is going to follow with a much better position for white. So here, black simply has to move the queen, and you can put it just about anywhere. It doesn't matter. Knight g5 is the follow-up, and there's just no way to defend against queen h7 mate. You might think there's queen d3, but unfortunately, e4 is going to prevent any ideas you had at defending that square. So once the rook moves away, well, there's a lot of fun to be had here, but just to give a sample line, you can take the pawn. Not only do we have queen h7 check here, queen h8, and continuing to take material that way, but unfortunately for black, even just a simple, quiet move, such as rook d1, is probably going to lead to a very, very bad position for black. I'll just give you a sample line of what could happen. Bishop e8, check, check, queen takes g7, and after king d6, b3, and if this queen moves away anywhere, white is very interested in playing the move knight e4 checkmate. If the queen goes over to h4, we have g3, and you can see this queen is really trying to defend the e4 square from wherever she moves, but alas, queen g4, the only square available, falls to knight f7 check, and queen takes g4. So that is the trick that some people are aware of that does win for white, that bishop takes h7. And I wanted to mention an important detail because I have some experience here. At one point, I was ready to uncork this exact same tactic, and black played the move queen takes d7. Not bishop takes, but queen takes d7. And after bishop takes d6, queen d6, takes, bishop takes h7, you'll find out that it doesn't actually work out to be the exact same tactic because in this position, the move g6, there's no knight takes c5 and knight takes d7 because that bishop isn't sitting there. And first of all, it's very easy for the white player to panic when they get in this position and realize, maybe I messed up the entire trick. How come that didn't work? So I think black wins a lot of games from this position. Although after queen g5, black saves the queen. White can give these checks. Knight f6 check. Black cannot go to h8 because of mate. So unfortunately, after king g7, knight h5 check, And again, there's no going back to h8 because of mate in 2. So this would actually just be a draw by repetition. But a lot of the white players don't know this when they're faced with the position, because they just panic when they see that bishop's not on d7. So I found that this move queen d7 back here is a really nice way for black to sort of equalize things in the opening. After this move, you're still intending to maybe go e5. You can still exchange these bishops and regroup the pieces. So I found that this is a pretty nice little trick for black to utilize. The white player might think that he's going down this mainline path with that bishop takes h7, but you'll be ready and waiting with queen takes d7, and suddenly your bishop is not sitting there on prise later on in the variation. I think you'll catch a lot of your opponents off guard here. So that's definitely one of the important lines here, queen e7. And then the other one I wanted to get into in this video was the move rook e8. Again, with the same intention, playing e5. And as the white player, you simply cannot allow this. There's no way that e5 can be played. So a lot of the times, knight e5 is played. That's the answer. That's how you stop e5 so early on in the game. And in this particular situation, if black decides to go bishop takes e5, d e5, knight d7, well, threatening the pawn here. Knight f3 is a very natural move, and to be honest, it's a pretty good one, but I've had a lot of success myself playing the move f4. And the reason I find f4 so interesting is actually black thinks that they're setting up a trap here with c4. The idea is bishop c2, queen b6, and well, would you look at that? Double attack. You cannot defend both pawns at once, and black usually goes on to win these games if the white player doesn't know what they're doing. But from my experience, castling actually gives white a very good position here. If black takes on b2, white intends just rook c1, and this pawn, of course, cannot be taken due to bishop takes h7 check. That's why we put our rook there. And if black just gets greedy and takes all these queenside pawns, remember that white is very close to uncorking. e4 in the center, f5 for the attack, maybe even swinging this knight to g5. And believe me, playing this a few times in blitz, you'll realize that white actually is seriously on the offensive here, and you can win a lot of nice attacking games. The other variation is queen takes e3, and you might say, why wouldn't I do that? That's with check as well. Well, I'm going to play king h1 as white here, and again, my idea is eventually to kick this queen out, and maybe just follow up with knight f3 and control the d4 square. So just to give, let's say, a sample variation, let's say this happens, knight f3, and at some point, white's going to play maybe queen d2 or queen e2, followed by bishop f2, put that knight on d4, and again, we have all these attacking possibilities, and this bishop with that pawn chain is not too happy. So from my experience, this is actually a clever little trap you can set for your pawn-grabbing opponent who's maybe been watching too much Yasser Seirawan. If they go after either one of these pawns, I've had pretty good success launching an attack on the king side. So that's why I think this line, which is essentially the main line, I would say, in the London system, is still pretty rich with ideas because this bishop takes h7 trick does not always work, and I think that queen d7 recapture is important. And rook e8, I've had a lot of success with just knight to e5 followed by f4 and baiting your opponent into trying winning one of your pawns. So I hope some of those tricks are useful for you in your games, and you stay tuned for the rest of the series as I break down more tips, tricks, and just things to watch out for in the opening of the London system that you might have not seen before. Hey everybody, Grandmaster Mon Hamilton back with the next part of this video series where I thought it's really important to talk about one of the most common structures that you can get from the London system. And what I'm referring to are the positions that you can get from the white side or the black side where both sides oppose their queens on b3 and b6, and there's an important decision to be made. And I think that there's a lot that still needs to be mentioned about those positions in order to play them properly. So first of all, we'll check out exactly what happens if white achieves queen b3 first and therefore is threatening to play c5. And of course, what I mean by that is that in the positions where black actually develops the bishop to f5 very early, what happens is that the main plan in the London system changes from being solid with c3 to being aggressive with c4, undermining the center and really trying to get the knight to c3 and the queen out to b3. So after c4, let's say e6, knight c3, c6, black is essentially playing the London system himself, but after queen b3, queen b6, one of the main moves to defend that pawn, c5 is an important move. Now, there's no queen c7 or queen a6 because of our nicely placed bishops, and it means that black has to capture the queen. Now, after this happens, a6 is usually played because white is threatening bishop takes b8, followed by rook takes a7. So black does that to save his pawn. b4, knight d7, and here white has a very thematic move, which is b5. And without this move, the position is still very good for white, but with this move, it's nearly winning. After b5, black simply has to deal with this pawn, and he needs to take it this way because of the pin. And here, after knight takes b5, again, it cannot be taken because of that pin. And after rook c8, there's a few moves like maybe knight d6, but I recommend the simple knight c3. And here, white essentially wants to follow up with knight to f3, b4, maybe sooner rather than later, and maybe just bishop e2 and castle, or even the more ambitious king d2 and bishop d3. And essentially, white wants to trade off all the pieces and at some point maybe play b4 and b5 later in the game. And all the play is on white's side here in this position. So let's examine maybe what if black plays knight h5, you might say. Takes my bishop. Well, I don't think there's anything to be concerned about. Bishop g3, give up the bishop pair because at this point you've already achieved everything you want on the queen side. Bishop e7, and at this point I really think the move king d2 is just very strong, followed by bishop d3. And in this position, white intends something like knight f3, b4, and maybe even swinging this knight to a5. This rook can swing over to b1, and white is just going to play b4, b5, and the resulting pawn formation is just going to be much worse for black. And you look at black's pieces, they also don't have anywhere to go. So this is the type of position which is much, much better for whoever ends up achieving it. Now, sometimes it's white and sometimes it's black. It depends on the position. So in this case, with an early bishop f5 from black, it's actually white who gets to play the quick c5 and force those queens to be exchanged in a nice way. Now, it can also be a little bit different. If we go back and we look at a position where white actually includes an early knight f3, a move that I did not include in the last variation. In this case, let's imagine that we play moves like this, and somehow we reach the position again where white plays queen b3 and black plays queen b6. Now this one is a little bit better for black because after the exact same moves as before, after b4, black is going to play rook c8. And the idea of rook c8 is that now there's no b5 because black has stepped out of the pin. So that's a very important inclusion for black, and it is a lot better to play this position now that this has been achieved. However, I still present this to you as a position which is much better for white. Now, I think the simplest move here is h3. Just to avoid knight h5, we're going to keep our bishop. It's controlling the b8 square. Now, why is that so important? Well, white is going to play knight d2, knight b3, and knight a5. That knight is going to hit that pawn, which surprisingly cannot actually be defended. I know it looks weird, but with this bishop covering that square, a knight on a5 hits that pawn, and there's just no way to defend it. If the pawn ever moves, then unfortunately for black, his pawn chain just gets undermined. So h3, I think, is the simplest and best way to play this, but if you're interested, I believe the move knight d2 is also very strong as well, quickly going to the a5 square, but it does require a bit of calculation for the move knight h5. So I think the move h3 is simpler and more direct. Now that you are a little bit familiar with the position, we can look at how black actually utilizes pretty much the exact same trick against white. And it all comes from the move c5. So in the opening, if white goes e3, c5, and then knight f3, knight c6, c3, the idea is that black can actually quickly jump with the queen to b6, hitting that pawn. And after queen b3, c4, you may have recognized this position by now, but once again, it is the exact same idea that black now gets the move b4, and after c takes b4, knight takes b4, utilizing the pin again, white is going to play rook c1, and after knight back to c6, although we're a tempo down compared to white having this position, it is still very, very strong. Black can choose to develop that bishop out there or not, but essentially the same plans that I discussed previously apply here as well. Now, the most important part is a little trick that you might know about, but it's important to ensure that after queen c2, you should know that bishop f5 is indeed a tactic. It cannot be taken because queen takes b2, and a lot of people think that after this, the idea is black takes the rook, and then you bring your queen back. You might trap that queen, but no, black plays the move e6, chasing the queen away from that square, and then takes the rook, which is completely losing for white. Don't make the mistake of thinking you might trap that queen. Now, apart from that, I like to utilize that trick against my opponent. So sometimes as white, I like to play queen c2 and bait him into the move bishop f5. Now, you might think it's the exact same trick, He's seen the idea where you deflect the queen and then you take here. And he would be correct, but white can throw in a nice little intermezzo here. D takes c5, hitting the queen. And if you recapture, of course, now you're just losing that bishop. And if you do not recapture, instead you take the queen. After you take here, pawn takes. Now white can just develop something like knight d2 or even knight a3. And if you look at the structure, these pawns are going to be weaknesses here. White has pretty easy development. Bishop b5, a4. This knight can jump into d4 or e5. And this is a nice way to trick your opponent who might be relying on this tactic. So what black should be doing in this position every single time is playing g6 in order to facilitate bishop to f5. But it's a nice way to catch your opponents off guard because everyone expects queen b3, followed by c4, and then queen c2. We have that tactic. But by doing it in this way, you'll often catch people off guard and hit them with that d takes c5 move, which to my eye gives a significant advantage to white. So it's a really important structure to get familiar with. The idea of the queens looking at each other. Neither side wants to capture the queens because those double pawns are very strong. And whoever gets to push either c5 for white or conversely c4 for black, whoever gets to push that pawn and even on a good day, eventually push the b pawn and make that favorable exchange, whoever gets to do that is going to have a much better position. So a lot of the times the London system is about trying to get that position and forcing favorable exchanges. So be on the lookout for that and stay tuned for the next part of this video series. Hi guys, Grandmaster Mon Hamilton back with the next part of this video series on London tips and tricks, especially in the opening part of the game. So what I wanted to take a look at in this video was the possibility that black decides to fianchetto. And this is a really common strategy against the London system because it places a pawn on d6. And this is generally thought to be the best way of dealing with that bishop, is that the bishop on f4, on this nice diagonal, there's nothing better against it than a black putting a pawn on d6. So that's exactly what black aims to do when he plays these lines that involve fianchettos. Whether he's a King's Indian player or Grunfeld, it doesn't matter. A lot of people decide to opt for this setup against the London system. A lot of times white goes for a quick h3. I think it's a very reasonable decision. And finally, black plays this move d6. So we reach kind of a critical position here. And especially from the black perspective here, I think what's important is that you can get a lot of very quick counterplay against an unsuspecting London system player who's just trying to stay solid. So the idea is that I'll first show you what I think is a reasonable line. I mean, this is just essentially the main line I want to say for a lot of these London system positions. You know, black might go b6. We might see bishop h2, bishop b7, bishop d3, a6, a4, knight d7, and essentially these positions here. I think that white is doing pretty well. It's comfortable. They've definitely been analyzed and played quite a bit, but in my opinion, white is doing decently here, and certainly I would take this position any day. So what I want to present from black's perspective is a way to be a lot more active in the opening and look to punish people who are trying to just get that solid London system setup that they want every time. White always wants to get that bishop to d3 with queen on e2, and what I'm suggesting plays directly against that. So after the move d6, let's say we see the move c3, c5, knight bd2, let's say, and the idea is that as soon as knight bd2 gets played, very quickly we play c takes d4, inviting e takes d4, and follow it up with knight c6. And the first idea is that, you know, a move like bishop d3, we can already see is no good here, because black is already ready to use the e-file, white's not castled, and most importantly, you cannot put your bishop on d3, as the move e5 is just going to win on the spot. So already, this would be a very tough position, and black is doing extremely well. So if not the move bishop d3, well, what about the move bishop e2, for example? And this opens up an entirely different door, that after pawn e5 here, it looks like it's just a pawn on priest, but again, this is the active, direct way that black can play this opening. Pawn takes, knight takes e5, and knight d5. Hitting the bishop and also uncovering an attack on the knight. White only has one move here, and it's knight takes c6. But after black plays b takes c6, white will shuffle the bishop to one of the only available squares. Bishop e3, allowing knight e3 is simply not an option, especially with queen h4 in the resulting position. So bishop g3 gets played, and in this position, black plays the calm rook e8. And it uncorks this really impressive tactic that after castling, bishop takes c3 can actually be played. And this is a really surprising tactic because you're giving away your dark square bishop, at least temporarily, and it doesn't look like something like that should be possible. So this has actually happened to me numerous times before I finally realized how strong this tactic was. If white decides to play knight c4 here, then black has an even more impressive move that justifies the entire variation, bishop takes b2. Bishop takes b2, once again sacrificing the bishop and ensuring that knight to c3 is always possible. And after this, even if we throw in a queen trade, black takes that bishop with check first. So no matter if you take this bishop and allow knight c3 or try to play knight c4, black is always going to have an answer here. And this is just a really aggressive way to start the game. And a lot of times the London system player with white is unprepared for these tactics and how complicated the game can get, because there's a lot of ways to blunder even before you get there. The other way that white can play, instead of, let's say, a quick c3, is the move bishop h2, which to me makes a lot of sense. It's often the move that I play when I'm in these very positions. You want to get the bishop out of the way because white recognizes that this is a pretty serious threat. Now, as black, we should essentially go for the same type of setup. c5, okay, if c3 happens, and the reason we play c3 all the time is after queen b6, we always want to play queen b3 as white. So in this position, though, once again, we take and play knight c6. And this knight c6 move is, you guessed it, preparing the move e5. So white has a number of moves he can do here. Let's say knight d2. Once again, we go with e5. And if you take that, well, black's just threatening e4. This knight doesn't have the d4 square to go to. And you cannot take this because, I mean, this position is just completely winning for black. That bishop is going to be lost on e5. So the idea is that black can always get this e5 move in. And if he doesn't get the e5 move in, that white is going to have to compromise the intended setup. But basically, black is getting this e5 move by force. It's very active. It opens up this dark square bishop, and it challenges this pawn structure, which is so strong against that bishop. So there's the line that I presented at the beginning of this video where black develops, white develops, but in my opinion, white should be comfortable there. And that's the system type of play that white wants. But if you're trying to play aggressive and really deal with these players who are trying to get a solid setup from the London system, I think this is a fantastic way of doing just that. C5, very quickly taking on D4 and following it up with knight C6 and E5. And you can check for yourself, but you won't be surprised to know that the tactics definitely work out, and they usually work out in black's favor. So that's one nice way to play with black when white is trying to set up this London system, let's say V formation, which is really common here. I think this is a great way to play against that. Now, from white's perspective, just so I don't leave all the London system players out, my recommendation for white when dealing with the fianchetto is absolutely to go for knight to c3. And knight c3 presents, a number of great attacking options, but usually black doesn't play d5. White gets the e4 move in, and pretty quickly opposite sides castling, followed by an assault on the king side for the white player. So this is my recommendation for playing white against someone who fianchettos, but a lot of people still want to stay with that traditional V formation, set up the classical London system. And if they do that, I think you can generate some very quick, very active play with the move c5, c takes d4, knight c6, and a very quick e5 in the center. So stay tuned, guys, for the next part of this video series, and we'll see you soon. Hey everybody, Grandmaster Mon Hamilton back with another part of this London Tips and Tricks video series. And today what I wanted to focus on in this video was the idea of the pawn on b2 being attacked very quickly. And this is, I think this is one of the most annoying things for anybody that wants to play the London system. And I'm talking about attacking that pawn as early as, let's say, the third move of the game. After c5, e3, queen b6, black makes this uncomfortable threat, and it already looks like the move b3. I mean, is it the only option? Because playing the move b3 is something that white essentially never wants to include in any of his London system positions. The move queen c1 in this position would drop a pawn, but even if it didn't, it's not the type of move you want to play. Normally, queen b6, we want to meet with the move queen b3, but alas, that is not always possible based on the move order. So in this particular position, white tends to go for the move knight to c3, or more fashionably lately, knight to a3. The reason that this position isn't seen too much is because it's actually just a forced draw. After queen takes b2, white has to go knight b5. It stops queen c3 check. It gets the knight out of danger, of course, and it threatens knight c7. And this variation would be the 100% exact same if white played knight c3. He would follow up with knight b5. And the idea here is that black then plays knight d5, guarding that knight c7 threat, attacking the f4 bishop, one of the most important pieces in this position. And at this point, white doesn't really have that much to do. Rook b1 attacks the queen, and, well, after the queen makes the only legal move, queen takes a2, then white here has a choice. If white would like to, play on, he has to play essentially c4 and go for this sort of weird, dubious position where he takes the rook on a8, but unfortunately that knight is going to disappear at some point down the line, and black should stand a bit better, getting the two pieces for the rook at last. So what usually happens is actually just a repetition. Rook a1, queen b2, rook b1, and repeating like that. If white is ambitious and tries to actually play for the win here, then you may see the move a3. And I classify this move actually as a mistake by the white player, because although this takes away the square and c3 is covered, you can see how this knight may get trapped. Let's say a6. Now, rook b1, queen a2, the only move. Again, white has this draw available, but let's say that he's ambitious and he wants to trap that queen. That's the whole point of playing this line. Queen c1, and after pawn takes, rook a1. And he's actually succeeded in trapping the queen, but I don't recommend this line because of a move that I'm not sure is entirely obvious to the computers at first. Queen takes a1, queen takes a1, and here the really important move is the move e5. Black does anything else, I think white is doing generally okay, but this really impressive move e5 hits the bishop, it forces the action, and after bishop takes e5, I mean, what else? That's the most natural move. Black plays the move c4, stops the bishop from hitting that b5 pawn, gets ready to uncover rook takes a3, knight c6 is going to be with tempo hitting that bishop, and everything in black's camp is working harmoniously right now. So this is exactly the type of position that white does not want to be in. You won the queen, but all the initiative, all the pressure is now in black's hands, and this is certainly not the right position to get out of the opening. So it's actually dangerous if white tries to go for anything more than a draw, which goes to show that this queen b6 move in the opening, I mean, this knight a3, knight c3, they're probably good enough for equality, but not much more. So that's already a pretty nice move for black to play just out of the opening. And, you know, there are other positions where that move queen b6 comes into play. You know, another one is, let's say very quickly, c5. And after knight f3, let's say queen b6. So once again, that pawn's being hit. But in this particular example, after the move knight c3, queen b2, knight b5, it's a lot different having that extra piece develop. There's no knight d5 for black like the previous line. And this queen, in a lot of variations here, either gets trapped or black is running into the knight c7 trick. So from black's perspective, you can take that pawn in by playing the queen to b6 on the third move, but do not get greedy and take that pawn in many of the other positions, as white is leaving it there as sort of a poisoned pawn. Now, another thing I wanted to focus on was actually one of the strange things that can happen in the London system is all black wants to do, it seems, is somehow take this dark square bishop. So white is often playing the move h3. And there's, of course, the main line, which sort of goes like this, knight c6, knight d2, and black goes e6, and white goes c3. And the move knight h5 is well met by bishop g5 for the moment. And one of the things which I sort of realized over the course of playing against the London system myself is that there's a very interesting move here, and that's bishop e7. And bishop e7 doesn't look like it threatens really anything. Actually, the main move, bishop d6, would be met by bishop g3. And we've already looked at a few lines where that's exactly the case. This move, bishop e7, is actually designed to take away bishop g5. So if white plays bishop d3 and continues as if nothing has happened, my idea is knight h5, hitting that bishop. Well, if bishop e5, I don't necessarily want a position like this where white might take with tempo and uncover an attack on the knight. Instead, f6, bishop g3, and just the move g6. And if anyone is familiar with this position, maybe with colors reversed, just remember that this is actually the queen's gambit, and the position that black has is often the position that white has playing against the queen's gambit Slav or semi-Slav himself. So it may look familiar for that reason. But the idea is after g6, black can take that bishop at some point, and the two bishops against the London system is always going to be very close to equality. So I consider this to be a pretty good position for black. And for that reason, after bishop e7, somebody might realize that, hey, you know, this knight h5 move is actually a threat. And then the move h3 comes to mind. And after the move h3, I just found it pretty interesting to then play with black pieces, bishop d6. And the idea is that there's no bishop g3 anymore. All of a sudden, that move isn't available. F takes g3 is just a catastrophe. We can't ever play that move. So in order to deal with the fact that our bishop's attacked, well, trust me, a lot of the players with white are just going to take this bishop. And this is really a tremendous achievement that if they just develop normally like this, we're going to castle and then play e5. And I've already discussed that allowing e5 is not something that white can ever permit in the London system and expect to have a good position. So the idea is that you're trying to get your opponent to take that bishop. Now, from white's perspective, I definitely recommend d takes c5 here. And the idea being that that bishop would have to move 3 times to recapture it. But even still, the resulting position for black is really not so bad. And, in this particular game, black is going to get the rook out. He's going to get the queen out. I don't think that, we should be too concerned for black here. Even bishop d6, moving that bishop once again. It seems crazy, but it's really not that bad here. So I've had a lot of success in the opening, playing this move bishop e7, trying to get white to play h3, and then following up with the bishop to d6. And that little stutter step means that bishop g3 isn't available. And a lot of the times when you're playing someone who plays a system, and I'm talking, of course, about people who play the London system, they just have a sort of sense of this robotic setup that they're looking to get out of the opening. They're almost on autopilot. And usually whenever you throw a wrench into the plans of someone who's got a system figured out, it really does work well. So most people who play the London system know that the move bishop d6 is met by bishop g3. So even just throwing them off and giving them a position they might not have seen before, from my experience in my games, it actually does work really well. So it's not like it's a free win or anything like that, but it's just a small trick for the opening to either get the bishop pair or throw your opponent off guard and give him a position that he's never seen before or never had to deal with. And I think that's an easy way to get some, I don't know if I can say quick wins in the opening, but certainly to throw your opponent off and maybe get a good position where after bishop takes, you get a very quick e5. And I believe that black simply stands better after that, or at the very least is extremely comfortable, not dealing with any of the normal issues that the London system can pose. So that's just a little offbeat move that I have had some success with. So I thought I'd share it with you. And thank you for tuning into this video, but we've got another one coming. So stay tuned and hope to see you in the next one.
Just like the street lights lit this town, like a fire in a blaze, gotta burn it down. Can't be afraid to leave this out. We got this far, don't know how. I see danger in your eyes. They know we'll burn down the night. Coming just like the sunrise. You know that we gonna let it away. Tonight, we gonna let it away. Tonight, we gonna let it away. Just like the sunrise, we gonna
everybody, Grandmaster Mon Hamilton here with the final part of this video series on the London system, tips and tricks for both sides, white and black. In this one, it's actually my favorite video because I get to show you some of the weirdest and most offbeat random moves that I've seen for and against the London system, and hope that they might be useful for you in your games. The first one is completely silly, but it definitely deserves a mention because of how often it actually works. And it's embarrassing to say, but after the move bishop f4, especially playing online on chess.com, whether it's blitz, bullet, one of the moves that you usually play right after that, and the move that I actually recommend, is the move e3. And so from black's perspective, the move h5 is an incredibly surprising move, but after the move e3, if you just play it without thinking, of course h5 is a terrible move, but the move e3 played without thinking is kind of miraculous, but it actually loses a piece after the move e5. So e5 gets played. Now, white can play d takes e5. It doesn't really matter. The move g5 follows. Bishop g3, h4. I think you see where this is going. If white plays bishop takes e5, the move f6, and, well, you can see that the squares are limited. And after this, again, that piece is lost. So, of course, there's going to be a few ways that white can maybe get 1 or 2 pawns here, or maybe make the king move for black. Something can happen, but at the end of the day, it's good for black. You win a piece, and then the computer evaluation will support you. So be very careful not to be always pre-moving something like e3, or not even pre-moving, but just playing too quickly. You might see h5 and say, what the heck is this? I'm just going to keep going with my normal London system moves. But you would be surprised how often this move actually wins an entire piece because nobody knows about the move e5. So that's the first one that is completely surprising, but really does work more often than it deserves to. So be very careful of that. Or if you're playing with black, I'm not recommending everyone plays h5, but be very careful when you see that. The other, I guess, pretty important move to look out for is, now it does look very strange, this move knight c6 for black, but believe me, there's actually more poison to this move than you might think. So first of all, after bishop f4, I have to first talk about the move e6. And okay, white might play e3. And after bishop d6, a move that I would almost recommend, if not for the purpose of this video, is the move knight d2. Because I actually really love these positions where black plays bishop takes f4, white recaptures with the e-pawn, has really good control over e5, and just follows up with c3, g3. So because I love those positions so much, I would probably play knight d2 here. But if I did, I would be falling directly into, well, the idea of knight takes d4. And this knight takes d4 move is just as strong as, let's say, takes with the bishop, followed by queen f6. The only reason is that queen f6, there are some positions where white can give up a pawn here and still be okay, whereas the complications after knight d4 are just incredible. It's this how astonishing the move is when you see it. And it's definitely one to look out for because, as I've mentioned, when you throw off the player who's trying to play a system and get a certain setup, it can often work really well. So I had this move played against me very recently in a blitz game, and just how astonishing it was when I faced it was enough to almost make it work. That after knight takes d4, e5, and the idea is you've got that fork there immediately. So I thought that this was just a really interesting trick to look out for, and the reason that you should look out for it is not so much that it works exactly in this move order, but that you can use that theme and apply it to what I would consider a much better move, bishop f5. So this is actually what I want to show you is a very interesting setup. It looks like the knight should never belong on c6, blocking the pawn. It's just crazy. But this idea of playing sort of a Shigorin setup with knight c6, bishop f5, you're almost doing to white what they're doing to you with the London system. So if white then goes e3, e6, let's say knight d2, bishop d6, this is where we start to realize that the exact same idea that we had last time now might come into play. You always got to be careful of knight takes d4 tricks. And of course, we have this knight takes f3 with check if white tries to take this bishop and get out of it that way. So knight takes d4 and bishop f4 are just always considerations. And now that you know about them, you should just be aware of them anytime you're trying to play e takes d4. And finally, in these positions, if white ever goes for the move c4, again, a move I would normally recommend. That's exactly how you play against a knight on c6. You play c4 and you want to play very quickly knight c3, queen b3. But because black has got these pieces developed so quickly, opportunity to play knight b4 is available. Knight c2 is a huge threat. There's really only one sensible move to defend it, and that's knight a3. After knight a3, in my opinion, black just has a much better position after the move c6. And the long-term idea is that black's going to play a5. He's going to play knight f6, bishop e7, castles, and white is not going to be able to dislodge the knight on b4, and therefore is not going to be able to move his knight on a3. Just observe the resulting position. Let's say everybody sort of develops normally. I'm not maybe making the best moves here, but let's just observe this position. And you might say, okay, we're in the middle game now. How does white actually get the knight out? Well, if you play knight b1, there's always knight c2. And knight c2 is not available. Meanwhile, rook c1 to move the knight drops the a2 pawn. So you're in this very strange position where there's just no good way to get this knight off the a3 square. If you take this pawn, black recaptures, and there's no squares available for the knight. So this can just be really frustrating to deal with. And in my experience playing it, whether you get this type of position with white or with black is extremely effective. Anytime you can place a knight on b4 for black or b5 for white and cause your opponent to have to put his knight on the side of the board, the fact is that knight is probably going to stay there for the rest of the game. The threat of the knight invading here is just too strong, and that piece is basically out of the game. So this is just a really interesting way to start the game for black, playing knight c6. It's really tricky. If white plays c3 and doesn't go aggressive with c4, it's also easy to get a good position with black by just playing bishop d6, knight f6, and castle. So it's sort of one of those offbeat lines that is really worth looking into because c4 seems to be the most natural way to play against it. But if that happens, it runs into knight b4. So this is one of those offbeat things, and pretty much everything in this video is something that you feel like you should never have seen before, or there's no way it should possibly work, or it really looks abnormal when at first glance. But the more you look into it, it actually does have its merits. And as I've always said against the London system, some of the best tricks or tips for the opening is to just try to get the person playing the London system uncomfortable or playing it in a way that's different than they're used to, because they're trying to play it in a very systematic, robotic, autopilot way, and anything to make them just a little bit uncomfortable or play a different system than they're used to. If you study up on that, then you're sort of bringing them into your territory and beating them with your experience playing that position. So those are just a few of the offbeat ways to play against the London system. And hopefully you found this entire video series useful, or at least inspired you to maybe take up a different approach, whether you're playing for or against the London system. I still think the London system is a great opening, but especially at the beginning of the game, you can often catch your opponents off guard with a lot of the tricks mentioned in this series. So thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Just like a spark that's breaking out. Can't make a stop, can't turn back now.